Okay, so I came to SACS in sub A, and it felt like an adventure. I was this bright-eyed little kid who came in, and yeah, I remember running in and out of. They had I think our first teacher was called Mrs. Woordeblom or Wonderbloom or something, and yeah, I remember running in and out of the classroom to my mom and the other moms, and like everybody laughing. I was the spontaneous little kid. I had been very sickly for quite a while before school, but yeah, so it was like a new experience. I had no preconceptions. I was the eldest sib, so I didn't have older siblings to kind of prepare me for it, and that was it. And I kind of launched into sub A. And I don't remember a hell of a lot of those early years. I remember inventing stories and telling them to my mom about things that happened at school on the playground, like fun things. And I actually don't remember grade stand sub B. I remember standard 1 with Miss Timmins. She had been a pupil of my dad, so she kind of knew of there was a link. And yeah, one interesting thing I remember, it was either in sub B or standard 1. I remember because I'd been quite a sickly kid, and I nearly died once from pneumonia and all that. And my mom had been in hospital quite a bit as well. I'd been quite an overprotected kid. And I remember standing on the front lawn in front of the, I think, sub B classroom or standard 1 classroom, and thinking if I don't like, so I think I'd been a bit overprotected, and I kind of pulled away, and I thought if I carry on like this, I'm not going to have many friends, and I want friends. So I'm just going to can this overprotection thing and fight for my independence and connect with my mates. And so I remember that with interest. It was like the first little sign of autonomy or something like that. Yeah, so, and then standard 2 to 4 were, I was quite a mixed up kid, I think, actually. No real direction. I remember the year at the boarding school, Mr. Dubert's class. I remember Warner at the queue pulling Brian Jackson out every break time. Yeah, I remember not being very motivated or focused and starting to lose. By then the magic of school had been well lost, I must say. Found it a bit of a grind. Grade standard 4, the same. I remember the graduates of the whatever it is, the Paul Training College or whatever it was, those guys, Van der Merwe, Oosthuizen, those oaks. I remember sort of, they walked around as a little kind of Broederbond watchdog kind of thing, being the protectors of the women teachers and coming into the class and grabbing some of us and giving us a bit of a whack. Yeah, so I think by then I'd also like become quite negative about school, I suppose. But I still enjoyed the sport, enjoyed the friends, and then in standard 7, so my dad was vice principal of Westerford, just down the road, and I think then it wasn't such a big issue, but I remember in standard 5 he stepped in because I was losing the plot a bit academically, and he stepped in and he went to speak to Laidlaw, was my teacher in standard 5, and he was also the cricket coach of the first team. So I was happened to be in the cricket team, and he went to speak to Laidlaw, and like they made a plan to like try and pull me back, and I responded okay. I mean, I did quite well at the end of standard 5. I actually enjoyed that year quite a lot. I enjoyed the cricket, and yeah.
What was the plan?
I remember playing cricket. Eh?
What was the plan they put
The
in?
plan was they were going to monitor my work, show a bit of an interest. Laidlaw wasn't like a hardcore disciplinarian. Yeah, it felt a little bit like in a quite sort of introverted way he was on my side. So I kind of, and there wasn't like hectic pressure. So he and my dad kept contact, and they monitored my work, and I kind of pulled my socks up.
If I heard you correctly, this was a recognition of you, and that they were taking an interest in you, and that you responded positively to that. What does that say about the way you were before? Did you feel? I mean, you say you almost like you were feeling alienated from school from standard 3 till 5.
Yeah, I wouldn't say totally alienated, but alienated from the authority structure, and there was this big gap, and I did feel like just a number. I didn't consciously think this at the time. Please, I didn't. I mean, I just put it on like most people, I guess. And yeah, so there was no like real consciousness around this, but I did, in retrospect, I can see that I was just a number. I felt like a number. I mean, I didn't feel sorry for myself or over angry at the time. I did get angrier later, but yeah. So yes, I suppose there was no sense of, as you say, real connection between me and people as adults. Just what happened. There was no big. If I compare, I've got a lot Lamaki now, and if I compare the rituals and the transition from primary school to high school now, and what he experienced and what my daughter experienced, it's just chalk and cheese. It's so different. There's so much more preparation and ritual around it. It was it was just the next stage, but with no real markers in place. Yeah. And I remember going into Vught's class, Max Vught, with his spark plugs in his briefcase and his old car. Yeah, he's such a cute old man in retrospect, and we gave him a hard time. Shame. No, I think I became relatively disengaged again in standard 6, 7. In fact, I can remember very little of standard 6 and 7. I honestly can't remember whose class I was in. I have no clue.
Miss Besson.
Miss Besson, right? Yeah, she was a character. I suppose I remember because I was kind of fanatical about cricket in those days. That gave me a bit of a thread, and I enjoyed other sports, but yeah. And so, and I remember Johnny Ince from right from the beginning. Like he was like the Mr. Chips character who showed an interest in everybody, remembered everybody's name, and yeah, what an awesome guy. I mean, what a standout guy. Yeah. Because he engaged with everybody. He could exercise respect without being authoritarian about it. Really good guy. And one of the few times I went back to SACS as an adult was for his memorial service at the school. Yeah. And I remember Ali Abrams because he was like the cricket guy. And I know a lot of people, he was a complex dude and like probably quite a difficult oak. But I mean, I was like all over the place, but I learned from that guy. You know, I learned about passion and excellence, and he was the first guy who I remember in history. I don't know whether it was standard 8 or 9, but he created his own notes as an alternative to the education department notes. And he said, this is what I'm teaching you. This is what's in the textbook. And so So whether it was his schoolwork or his cricket, he would be fanatical with his cricket. He would take his video camera along in those days, and he'd video you, and he'd take you aside, and he'd tell you what you were doing. So I mean, yeah, I had respect for him as well, and I think he played a role in my sort of staying more or less on the straight and narrow as I went through high school.
Whoa.
Because as I got older, coming to my dad, I became more and more like rebellious towards my dad. He symbolized the education system, doing things the traditional way, and I would occasionally pick up the phone and I'd get disenchanted Westerford guys shouting obscenities down the line, assuming that it was him. I mean, that wasn't pleasant. But my family was a very, let's say, conservative, prim and proper family. And so I was out to trash that. And I did it in a way where I must have been a horrible, horrible parent. So part of that was really doing badly at school, quite in a calculated, lazy way. Yeah. So, I mean, I look back on those times and I think, yeah, I understand my adolescent rebellion and all that, but I did take it to an extreme where I shot myself in the foot throughout everything that was of value, as well as that which maybe was fluff. Sure, definitely not. Yeah. And I didn't realize the full import of it at the time, but it planted a very important seed. Yeah, I remember. I don't remember deeply too many, but I do. I think for standard 9 and 10, if I'm correct, I was in Mo Orford's class, and I think you were in Mo Orford's class as well, and for matric anyway. Was it also standard 9? Maybe. It was a very good year for me in many ways. Yeah, also. I mean, just one other teacher that I do remember was Bill Schroeder. For his sense of humor and his way of disciplining. And I bumped into him when he went to Rondebosch later. A few ways. He was cool. And another guy I remember was Thurman, the Latin guy, Latin and history, I think, or Latin and English. And I remember he also coached cricket at one stage when I was in the second. And like a solid dude, but was also very open. And I remember having a few drinks with him at Forries in years following SACS. Yeah. And then Mo Orford, he was great. I really enjoyed him. He had his sort of subtle Yorkshire sense of humor, but he was quiet and unobtrusive. And in his own way, he didn't buy into the whole traditional bullshit system, which was, of course, epitomized by that school photograph, which we all remember. And I remember him coming back after Patterson had probably torn strips off him. And he actually shared with us his personal feelings about it. And it created quite a sense of solidarity in the class. Yeah, amazing. Yeah. And he had an attitude to English literature, which I remember now. Yeah. Interesting, because he was so laid back on one level, but he was obviously quite competent. And yeah, I remember you being incredibly patient and impatient with me. And we used to spar quite a bit in matric. And I remember the one occasion when Schroeder said something, and I said, "Yeah, the black dot," referring to you. Yes. But I know I was like really quite a mixed up when it was moving towards parties, getting involved and all that. And you were very patient with me. You and I had some good spars, but God, I must have been a pain. Yeah. And I remember going to a house in that year as well. Yes. In Heading Estate, April. I was very young.
So
which also played a role. Yeah, so I was young. Yeah, I was physically smaller and less developed. I only hit puberty in probably standard 9 matric. Yeah, I do think it made me feel a little bit less than. In fact, when I working with addiction, I don't know whether you know that was the field I've worked in a lot. And one of the group lecture discussions I have with the guys, the people who come in for treatment, is on shame. And we look at the sources of shame, family, school, all those things. And I always highlight, how kids are pretty sharp. And if you're the last guy to get ball hairs, they will make you know it. Or if you're the first guy, and those kind of, so yeah, those kind of things did make me feel a little less than, put it that way, at that time. Yeah. To not very skillfully though. Not very skillful.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
Very clumsy, I think. Yeah. Cricket, and I played rugby.
Yeah.
I enjoyed football, but
so then
played tennis. Yeah, I'm so young, and I'm so glad to be free, euphoric about being free. So I go to varsity, and I just really party and draw, and hang out with people, and completely screw up my first year. I was just, because I was naturally good at English, I did okay at English. And I mean, these days I probably wouldn't have qualified to get a second chance. And my old man I was actually initially going to do teaching. My old man had a bursary. I had the education department bursary. So I didn't even write exams for most of my at the end of that year. And so I crashed. The old man said, right, you're out here, you're out on your own, Boyke, which was the best thing he could have done. Actually. There was no sort of second chance from him. So I kind of started finding my own gravitas, I suppose. And I went out, and I didn't want to go to the army. I was shit scared of going to the army without some degree, and I was very ambivalent about the army, obviously. So I got a whole lot of jobs, and I started paying my own way through varsity. I moved out of home, and I started again. And I worked hard, and I played hard, and it was a wonderful year. It's an amazing year. Yeah, I was studying psychology, sociology, English. I only did English 1, which I kind of all this sort of soft subjects, I suppose. Public administration, which was a stuff. Then I graduated. I just did my undergrad at UC.
Why did you choose that
path? Okay, I think in my first year, as I say, despite my interesting, now that I look back on it, very interesting, despite my rebellion against the education system, I initially planned on being a teacher. Probably just, there were a whole lot of teachers in my family. But I also, I've always felt, probably if I look back, I've always felt an affinity with the underdog. And at school, I think the kids were the underdog in certain kinds of schools. And so maybe I thought I could be a different kind of a teacher or something. I don't know. But anyway, I continued with that to the end of that degree, not quite sure what I would do. I was actually quite interested in journalism, and I thought maybe I'd shift into something like journalism. And then I met my future first wife while at varsity. Lived in an amazing digs house with people from all over the world. There were only a couple of us that were UCT students. There were guys and girls from all over. That was amazing. And then the house was in Bishop's Court. Some guy who was the grandson of the Terry's, Julian Terry. He was the grandson of the Terry's chocolate people in England. He had come out here on a world, and he stopped off at Cape Town, and he'd met somebody who was in my wife's social work class, who happened to be black, and kind of stalked early on. It was before that kind of thing was common. And anyway, so his aunt owned this mansion in Bishopsport, and he managed to persuade her to turn it into a communal. And so
that is interesting.
I remember having this tiny little room, and I paid about 30 Rand a month for this room in Bishopsport, in this mansion with this beautiful garden. Yeah. So I must say, when I look back, my level of political awareness was not, even having gone through university. I think because I worked bloody hard. I had to, after hours to get my fees and all that kind of. I didn't have much time to focus on anything else. Well, which could be seen as an excuse, but I didn't get involved in student politics or anything like that. And then I went to the army, which of course was, I went to Voortrekker Hoogte in Pretoria, with a whole lot of graduates. It was, exposed to the most primitive form of ideological brainwashing. We then, my girlfriend at the time, her family lived in Pretoria, so I kind of used to go off to the farm there, sometimes on weekends. And I got to know a lot of Afrikaans people who were, I mean, obviously I was exposed to a lot of very racist people, but also some very amazing Afrikaans people who were very much the so I've never really had that stereotype of us and them around Africa. And then I did an officer's course, which I thoroughly enjoyed, just the physical aspect. But then I was like really into hardcore physical stuff. And then I got drafted in, somebody mentioned it the other day at the other storytelling set, into a kind of Mickey Mouse personnel, doing job descriptions for people in the army and the air. And it was a complete fuck up from beginning to end. They poured money into it. They got graduates involved. And, change the design of the job description framework over and over and throw away the stuff. Anyway, I then saw a gap and I managed to get transferred to the Navy, so I could get back to Cape. And I think my last 9 months I spent in Cape, staying in the dockyard, which I hated as well. I mean, the Navy was full of like very pompous, in my opinion, sort of hardcore Navy guys. I really didn't enjoy that. Somebody who was with me, we were kind of mates. It was Martin Slack. He was 1 year ahead of us. Yeah, and we became quite friendly. And then after that, I was also one of those where it started off, I don't know, 1 year or 18 months, and then it turned into 2 years which was like but what I did do is I started studying through uni. I started studying psychology honors through uni, which gave me some sense of progression and then when I got out, I got a job at the Red Cross Hospital's psychiatry department, literally doing play therapy all day on my knees. And at that stage, I still wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but working as part of a multidisciplinary team, and understanding what was going on with those kids and the parents and the families, it sparked my interest enormously. And I guess I think things happen in our lives that nudge us in a direction, maybe that is part of our day. And so I decided to carry on with my honors and finish it while I was working there for a couple of years. And then I got into the master's course at UCT. And no, not at UCT, at UNI. I didn't even get an interview at UCT. They're very heroic. And we had to move up to Pretoria because it's too practical to do correspondence. And yeah, it was very exciting, dynamic, different kind of approach to the one at many universities, more systemic. and more accessible, I think. And then I did my internship at a hospital called Westkoppies Hospital, which was the epitome of Afrikanerdom. So obviously it was like in Pretoria West, where ISCOR is and all the Appies live. And I mean, we had people from mothers who killed their kids, criminal guys, to I remember seeing one guy from UCT who, I remember when I was at UCT, played rugby for the first team. He was in the engineering, going well. I remember seeing him there in DTs from his alcoholism, like completely having lost it, brain cells. But anyway, I'd say it was quite an unhealthy system, but I learned a lot there. My wife also worked there as a clinical social worker. And then when we fell pregnant, we decided to come back to, when I qualified, I had 1 year of working in children's homes in private practice. Then we came back to Cape Town. By then, I think it was about 1984, 85. Yeah. My eldest was born in 84. And I worked at a place of safety, so-called safety, for kids who've been removed from families or their families were unable to look after. Both and exposed to, of course, I was permanently employed by the white, in the white social welfare, whatever department, health department. But I did some sessions at the colored one, and where the gangs were like running riots through the place. And then Doug Pierce was involved. Yeah. And then I got a job in Athlone at a clinic that was part of the UCT Groote Hospital system. And that was like in the mid-80s, and it was very politicized. My colleagues, I was the only white guy. And in those years, the political activity and atmosphere in Athlone, this was in like Heideveld, Manenberg area, was extremely high. And I started waking up to things that I'd been asleep to for quite a long time, but in a very new way. And I joined a sort of lefty psychology grouping that was trying to make psychology accessible to other than those who could afford the services, the middle and upper middle class. And through that, I got involved with working with political prisoners, some in Pollsmoor prison who'd been tortured and, gone through the whole wet bag treatment and all that. And that created an interesting crisis as far as, I also joined a group. It was allied to the ECC, the End Conscription Campaign, which was looking not to necessarily end conscription, but to create constructive alternatives that people do that with military. And then I had a little crisis because I was called up to do it during this time. And I thought, what the fuck do I do now? Do I refuse? What do I? And it was at the 2 military hospital in Wynberg. It wasn't to go into a combat situation. And I remember those people at the clinic I was working at were incredibly supportive. They supported my decision. So in a kind of wishy-washy way, I did the camp, but I refused to wear uniform, which was just a token. So I was really just working as a psychologist. People of all races who were in the army who'd lost limbs, but it was like a 1 month. But I just remember that was hard.
How did that go when you say you refused to wear a uniform? A couple of guys have talked about taking stands in the army. How did that go?
It was tolerated. I mean, I was in a very, I suppose, slightly protected department in a hospital. I'm sure it wouldn't have gone down it wouldn't have been as tolerated as in some other setting. Yeah. Yeah, so I didn't have to like it wasn't an ordeal from that point of view. I didn't have to fight. Yeah, I must admit it was. Yeah, it's just the epitome of showing the futility of war and how I don't know. By then, I think there's no one thinking, that I did this for my country and feeling like a hero. Put it that. Um, it was just sad. Yeah.
So
So I
what?
carry on working there for a while, and at satellite clinic of the Kuritsky Falkenberg UCT system, I do a little lecture and a lot of therapeutic work. Some unbelievably difficult situations to handle, like having a group therapy situation with about 4 women who had been raped and 1 guy who'd been raped, stuff like that, hectic. Um, and then I moved to the Cape Town Drug Counselling Centre, which was like an off counselling centre. Part of the attraction was that they were developing a community project in London. And so I applied specifically to work in that. And geez, it was also a big learning experience, working in the community, uh, learning in no uncertain terms that your expertise is regarded with great suspicion. You have to consult and negotiate every step of the way. And then I was then asked to take over as the director of that whole organization. And I started I was incredibly naive about addiction when I started, but I learned quickly. I suppose I've always been a little bit of an innovator, and because my training was a little bit different to the average training that people down here, I brought in a few new ways of working, and yeah, those were good years. Yeah, work-wise, those were very good years. And it was very exciting developing that project in London. But after I left, I'm not sure what happened. It was an interesting situation because on the one hand, you were doing this community work. On the other hand, Adele Searle was the patron of the Drug Counselling Centre because her kid had gone through a whole experience. And, so you have the wealthiest of the wealthy getting involved. But I kind of learned, I was very skeptical of her, but I learned to respect her. She got her hands dirty and she got right. Yeah. So, yeah, and then she passed away a few years later from melanoma. And then I got co-opted into I got offered a job running a private clinic, Kenilworth, to head up the chemical dependency unit there, which I then took on. During that time, I got divorced between the drug counseling things. So that was also a big thing in my life. It was a tough time. I remember drifting from place to place, not really having a place to live, settled place for keeping contact with my son. That was like my one primary. And then discovering, interestingly, it might sound strange to outside. I was working with people, some of whom were clinicians, and 1 or 2 who were trained counselors who themselves had been through the addiction process and come out the tunnel on the other. And the ones who'd really done their work were such incredible people. And I'd always looked at the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous and NA and all that with a lot of skepticism. Thought it looked a bit culty in all my years of working in the field. But then working with these people, I was struck by, they had a certain kind of integrity and honesty, joy, and calmness that was quite impressive. So I became more curious about that. And one of our ex-clients, who owned at that time what was the Komati Hotel, and they were just about to turn it into an international hotel, gambling place or something. He was finding his own feet in his recovery. He's like a very well-connected person. He offered the person I was running the program with and myself his hotel to start a new treatment center. Kenilworth was okay, but the physical environment wasn't really, it was very close and traditional site, and we were looking for something that was more holistic. And so we went and had a look, and in some moment of madness, we decided we're going to do that. And so this other person that working with was in recovery, and yeah, we decided to do it, and we turned the pub into a group therapy room, and one of the other pubs into a nurse's station, turned it into a psychiatric hospital, that with a lot of help from Dave, the guy who owned it. And yeah, after 6 months, we were ready to open. We were told it wouldn't last for 6 months because we didn't have a license at the time. There's a lot of politics within the private hospital setup, as there is. But we did it, and we turned it into a really treatment center, which was getting noticed from overseas. And then we were the first treatment center to actually have a lot of clients coming from Europe and the UK. During that time, I started actually working the 12-step program because I felt I also had my own shit, and we should be walking the walk that we expect the clients to be walking. And yeah, I learned a lot about myself, my arrogance, my own forms of self-deception and all that. It was quite a humbling process for me, but a very good process. And yeah, those were amazing years. We worked our asses off, and it was the whole of my life, about 12, 13. And then during that time, I'd got remarried. I had my first Lart Lamaki, who's now 18. I mean, I very badly planned life where I've got a 23-year gap between my eldest and so I have an 18-year-old and a 14-year-old. So retirement is very far. And yeah, so those were great years. But eventually, I needed to reclaim my life a bit. So I stepped back, and with a lot of resistance from my two partners, I stepped back and moved into private practice. Did a little bit of work there, and then I tried to de-stereotype myself, because I've been very well known in Cape Town as the addiction guy, and I wasn't only trained to work with addiction, and I wanted to reclaim some of my other skills and the other parts. I went back into private practice, pretty burnt out, I might add. And then slowly from there, I've continued to develop my private practice. As much as I try to stay out of the addiction field, I suppose 40% of my practice is that. And I've got asked to consult, and I do a bit of training and supervision of counselor, and where I'm sitting right now, treatment center that gets clients from overseas. So it's very much, but I mean, some of the things that really, were amazing in Stepping Stones, we had a couple of sponsored beds for people who couldn't afford treatment. And we used to have groups. In one group, we'd have guys who were like company directors and guys who were gang who killed people, and just seeing the power of having something in common can do that brings such diverse people to, with a common purpose was amazing. So I mean, there were lots of things. There's a kind of spirituality that goes with addiction recovery that I found very interesting and appealing, and dimension that's very much part of my work and my life, sort of mystery, something bigger than us that comes with the process. Yeah, so I still find myself in that field. I still find myself passionate about what makes people change, how change is real, authentic change is brought about, how to deepen authenticity, and helping each person find their own psycho-spiritual direction. Part of where I'm at. As well as slogging my ass off to try and support a family with 2 kids, one who's finishing high school, one who's just started.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's such an interesting observation, and I've never really thought of it in that way. But now that you reflected back, I do think some of it, apart from the the ideology of leadership or leaders of the future and the questioning of the apartheid system that was thrown in all the time. Within that context, I think where people were passionate about something, whether it was maths or drama or whatever it was done with passion and excellence. And so for me, finding my passion was, I can't do this in a wishy-washy way. And so, the Ali Abramses, the Johnny Inces, Ralph Kelly with his choir, everything, Barney with his bloody rugby team, which I wasn't part of the first team, but still, all that stuff. It was done with passion and excellence and enthusiasm within the context of, all the things you've said about privilege and got to give back and all that. So maybe that's also just naturally that pushes you up into a leadership position. Yeah. I don't know, but that's just an off-the-cuff response, and it's probably far more layered than that. Yeah.